Jesus of Nazareth. Depending on who you ask, that name might make your heart feel full, your blood pressure spike, or your eyes roll. But today, I'm asking you to do something harder than all three of those. Set aside what you believe for a minute and just listen. Because this is not a religious video, it is not a sermon, but it's also not a denial. It's something a little more strange in modern discourse. This is an attempt to understand the philosophy of the man, not the Messiah, not the miracle worker, not the figure crowned in stained glass or painted on cathedral ceilings. I want to talk about the man named Jesus, Jesus the thinker, Jesus the philosopher, Jesus the wanderer from Nazareth who said things so strange and so powerful and so quietly revolutionary that even 2,000 years later, we still argue about them. This is not a video to convince you of his divinity or to disprove it. The Bible teaches that Jesus is both God and man. Whatever you make of the God part, today we're going to focus on the man. Now is an invitation to a thought experiment. Before we go any further, I want you to imagine a bowl. Just a simple bowl, ceramic, wooden, gold-plated, it doesn't matter. It just has to be big enough to hold every assumption you've ever had about Jesus. Now, I want you to place those assumptions into the bowl, all of them. If you were raised religious, maybe that means placing the idea that he's the literal Son of God into the bowl, along with the miracles, walking on water, turning water into wine, coming back from the dead. Put those in, just for now. If you're on the other end, maybe your assumptions sound more like Jesus never existed, Jesus was misunderstood, Jesus was just a myth, Jesus was a plagiarized mashup of older religions. Go ahead and put those in too. I'm not judging you. Whether you think he's your Lord and Savior or a desert philosopher who got mythologized by a cult, I'm not asking you to reject your own beliefs, not even for a second. I'm just asking you to set them aside for a moment. You can pick them up when we're done. They'll still be there. But for the next little while, I want you to go into this with an open mind, not a blank mind, just an open one. Because with a figure as polarizing, as mystified, and frankly as hijacked by culture wars as Jesus or Yeshua, the only way that we can ever hope to see through the fog is to set aside what we already think we know. So, before we start actually diving into what Jesus taught, we need to clear one thing out of the way, and it's long overdue. Jesus of Nazareth was a real person. I know. There's a very popular narrative, especially online, that says Jesus was just a myth, that he's nothing more than a recycled patchwork of Egyptian gods, Greek heroes, and Babylonian sky stories. And if you only ever listen to late night Reddit threads or YouTube atheists, that probably sounds compelling. But if you talk to actual historians, and I mean actual peer-reviewed, credentialed historians of antiquity, that myth that Jesus is a myth doesn't hold water. Almost every historian alive today, religious or not, accepts that Jesus of Nazareth existed as a real live human being. That includes agnostic historians, atheists, Jews, Muslims, Christians, and secular academics across the board. Whether or not you believe in what he claimed, the consensus is that there was a man named Yeshua who lived and taught and was ultimately crucified in Roman-occupied Judea in the early 1st century. In fact, and here's where it gets wild, Jesus of Nazareth is one of the most well-attested figures in all of antiquity. We have more historical references to Jesus than we do for that of Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, or Aristotle. No one is out here making TikTok saying Alexander the Great was probably just made up by Macedonian fanboys. But we do it with Jesus. Why? Because Jesus didn't just enter history, he shattered it. Even if we ignore every religious source and just focus on non-Christian, non-biblical historical writings, we still get a coherent picture. Jesus was baptized by a man named John, who was known for calling out corruption and dunking people in rivers. That Jesus became a public teacher, stirred up all kinds of social tension, and got himself executed by the Romans under Pontius Pilate. That shortly after his death, people began claiming to have seen him alive again, and those people went on to die for that claim. Now, you might not believe in the resurrection, that's fair, but the crucifixion, the baptism, and his existence, those are among the most universally accepted events in ancient historical scholarship. So no, Jesus is not a myth. You can argue about what he means, but you can't argue that he wasn't here. He was here. He walked this earth. And now that we've cleared the fog of fiction, let's finally talk about what he said as a man. So, we must also talk about the Bible, what it is and what it isn't. Before we start pulling from any text, let's talk about the elephant in the room, the Bible. Now, I see a lot of people talk about the Bible like it's a single book written by a single author pushing a singular idea, and to be honest, that's just factually incorrect. The word Bible literally means book of books. It is a compilation, not a novel. Think of it more like a library, a collection of poems, laws, prophecies, letters, and biographies, rather than a single cohesive narrative. It was written by around 66 different authors across thousands of years in multiple languages and across multiple continents. Some of it is poetry, some of it is war records, some of it is ancient legal code that reads like a divine tax form. And some of it, and this is where we're going to zoom in, is biographical writing. When it comes to Jesus of Nazareth, we're not going to be referencing Leviticus. We're not going to be quoting Revelation, which is basically ancient Hebrew apocalyptic scripture. We're focusing on the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And let's be honest, yes, the Gospels are biased towards Jesus being divine. No one is pretending otherwise. These are not cold, detached academic profiles. These are works written by people who genuinely believe Jesus was the Messiah. They believed he was the fulfillment of ancient Jewish prophecy. So yes, they are biased. But, and here's the important part, bias does not mean fiction. The gospel writers were trying to record the events of Jesus' life, what he said, what he did, how he died, and what they believed happened after. That intention matters. They weren't trying to write a fable. They weren't pushing a religious product. They were documenting what they saw or what was passed down by people who saw it. The Gospels weren't written hundreds of years later. They were written within decades of Jesus' life and death. That time frame is well within what historians call eyewitness window. And because of that, many secular historians consider the Gospels to be valid historical documents, meaning they are texts from around the time of the events they describe. Are they filtered through a religious lens? Of course. So is pretty much every historical account from the ancient world. But they're not just mythology. They're not fan fiction. They're not something some monk made up in a cave in the 1400s. If we're trying to understand the man, Jesus of Nazareth, the Gospels are the closest thing we have to direct access to his teachings. So that is where we will look. So now finally on to the main topic. It only took us like 7 minutes to get there, but I do feel like the context was important. So, with that being said, with the myth set aside, the history clarified, and the source material understood for what it actually is, that is why we will be using the four primarily accepted Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, as our primary source for today's exploration. This is not a sermon. This is not a debate about divinity. This is a philosophical examination of a man whose words have outlived empires, a man whose ideas have outlasted kings, a man whose sentences have shaped centuries. This is the philosophy of Jesus of Nazareth. First, we will begin with the Beatitudes, a philosophy of inversion. The opening lines of what's known as the Sermon on the Mount, recorded in the Gospel of Matthew. These are the first words out of Jesus' mouth in what many consider to be the most influential ethical speech ever given. And he starts not with law, not with fire and brimstone, but with blessing. Here's a quote, word for word. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Matthew 5:3-11 from the New King James Version. Now, let's pause, because we may have heard this many times before, stitched onto throw pillows, whispered at funerals, taught to children, that it's easy to miss how completely insane this is, philosophically speaking. Jesus is not blessing the strong. He is not blessing the successful. He's not blessing the conquerors or the rich or the wise. He is blessing the broken. He's blessing those who have lost everything, those who are mourning, those who are meek, not just humble, but stepped on. He says that the meek are the ones who inherit the earth. This isn't just countercultural, this is revolutionary moral inversion. In a world ruled by the Roman Empire, a world obsessed with strength, wealth, honor, and control, Jesus opens his public teaching by flipping the entire value system upside down. And he doesn't do it angrily, he does it gently with blessing. It's easy to overlook, but the Beatitudes form a kind of manifesto, not just for spiritual life, but for a redefinition of what matters most. Where other philosophers ask, what is truth? Jesus seems to ask, who is blessed? And his answer is not who you would think. Now, while more known, it is still radical 2,000 years later. Now, pause for a second and really sit with what Jesus just said, because even today in the modern world, with all of our supposed progress, human rights, sensitivity training, and social safety nets, we still don't bless the poor in spirit. We pity them, maybe, we pathologize them, but we don't bless them. We don't see someone who's broken, mourning, meek, and go, now that's who's winning at life. No, we bless the self-made millionaire. We bless the charismatic CEO. We bless the influencer who overcame adversity and now sells digital courses on how to become just like them. We bless the winner, the loud one, the powerful one, the one who takes what they want and tells their story first. We are Rome with better branding. And that's not to say that we haven't made real progress, because we have. However, the spirit is still very much the same as it was. Even in our kindness, even in our performative compassion, we often still only validate the broken once they've become inspirational, once they've turned their tragedy into content, once they've alchemicized their pain into a TED Talk or a memoir or a GoFundMe that raised 6 figures. But Jesus blesses the broken while they're still broken. Not after, not once they've recovered, not once they've healed, not even when they've begin to heal. Right there in the dirt at the bottom of the barrel. That's not just kind. That's revolutionary moral philosophy. It undermines every empire that's ever existed, from Rome to Wall Street. And here's the kicker, is that this was all 2,000 years ago. This isn't a guy writing in post-modernity, reacting to capitalism, colonization, or consumer culture. This was before medievalism, before industrialism, before modern psychology, and before humanism. These were the words of a poor, wandering, working-class Jewish man living under Roman occupation with no army, no wealth, and no formal power. And yet, somehow, this man said words that have lived longer than every government that tried to silence him. Now, here's another thing people miss. You hear a phrase like, treat the others the way you want to be treated, and think, oh, well, yeah, that's just basic decency. But it's not, and it wasn't. The idea, what we now call the golden rule, is credited to Jesus in its positive form. Do unto others what you would have them do unto you. Luke chapter 6, verse 31. Now, to be clear, similar concepts did exist before Jesus. Confucius had a version of it, so did the Greeks, but theirs were often negative formulations, more like, don't do to others what you wouldn't want done to you. But Jesus didn't just restrict harm, he commanded active goodness. Not just don't be a jerk, but go do good. That's a huge shift. He turned it from a warning into a way of life. So the next time someone shrugs off Jesus' teachings as just nice ideas, or acts like they're just generic feel-good sayings anyone could come up with, remind them that no one did until him. Now I would like to speak about 2 of the most famously misunderstood lines in the entire teachings of Jesus. The first, if someone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other also. That is Matthew chapter 5, verse 39. And also in Matthew chapter 5, verse 41 is, if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. Now, a lot of people, both critics and believers, treat these instructions like passive submission, as if Jesus is saying, let people walk all over you. But that's not what he's saying, and it's not even close. These aren't instructions on how to be weak. They're blueprints for how to reclaim your power when you are being dehumanized without becoming a monster in return. First, turn the other cheek. Notice the detail. If someone strikes you on the right cheek, that's oddly specific. Why the right cheek specifically? Because in a right-handed society, which Jesus's was, meaning you do not use your left hand for things, And to do so would look bad on you as an individual, as opposed to it being insulting to the other person. It would be insulting to the other person, but it would also make you look bad. Like people would look on you like, oh, why are you doing that? Why are you using your left hand? Anyway, if you slap someone on the right cheek, that means you're not punching them or just open palm slapping them. You are backhanding them because you are using your right hand to strike them on their right cheek, which would be your left. So it is a backhand maneuver. And a backhand was not just a hit, it was a deliberate insult, a power move, a way of saying, you are beneath me. You're not even worth the front of my hand. Masters backhanded slaves, Romans backhanded Jews, rich men backhanded the poor. It was dominance, plain and simple. And even today, we understand the disrespect behind a backhanded strike. So, what happens when you turn the other cheek? You force them to hit you as an equal. They either have to punch you, strike you with an open palm, which acknowledges that you're a peer, or they have to back away. Or they have to debase themselves by using their left hand, which would look bad upon them. You have just refused their dehumanization without raising a hand. That's not weakness. That's moral judo. Next is go the extra mile. This one is even more layered and will require some context. If someone compels you to go 1 mile, that word compel is not metaphorical. Under Roman law, a soldier could legally force any non-citizen, which included most Jews, to carry their gear or pack for 1 mile. No more, that was the limit. So imagine that. You are walking home, a Roman soldier stops you, throws 50 pounds of armor at your feet and orders you to carry it. You're not a person to him. You are a tool, a walking cart, a faceless subject of the empire. But then something strange happens. You carry it for the mile and you just keep going. You're no longer just complying, you're choosing. And suddenly the dynamic flips. The soldier is now walking with you, confused, maybe uncomfortable, because you're not an object anymore. You're not just fulfilling a duty. You are disrupting the power script. You're forcing him to walk beside you as a fellow human. So these teachings are not Jesus saying, let them abuse you. He's saying, when someone tries to reduce you to less than human within the existing power structures of the world, reclaim your agency in a way that exposes their cruelty without becoming cruel yourself. That's not just resistance, that's transformational resistance. It doesn't destroy your soul like revenge does, and it doesn't shrink your soul like submission does. It holds the line with strength, with peace, and with dignity. And more importantly, yes, you could get angry. Yes, you could try to strike back, but Rome would crush you. Rome was good at crushing people. That's what they did. This, however, left them no recourse. Even if they didn't acknowledge you as a human, they couldn't do anything about it. Even if they're going home saying, that's weird, that's a win for you. So ironically, in a world where many people see Jesus as synonymous with power, especially entrenched religious power, it's interesting for many to hear that Jesus was not a fan of power. If your image of Jesus is still a soft-spoken guy holding a lamb while whispering vague affirmations, then you haven't read what he actually said to the people in charge. Because Jesus, when it came to people who abused power, was relentless, not passive-aggressive, not politely critical. I mean full scorched earth verbally. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you are like whitewashed tombs, which outwardly appear beautiful, but within are full of dead men's bones and all uncleanness. That's Matthew chapter 23, verse 27. And also in Matthew chapter 3, verse 33, he says, you snakes, you brood of vipers, how will you escape being condemned to hell? That's not spiritual fluff. That's a man publicly calling out the most powerful religious leaders of his day to their faces in a culture where doing that could get you stoned. And eventually it did get him killed. And again, the historical context is very important here. To us, those might not sound like that crazy of insults, but at the time, that was one of the worst things that you could say to someone, especially someone in a position of power. The brood of vipers, for example, vipers kill their mothers in order to be born, or at least was the belief at the time. I have not fact-checked whether that is actually so or not. However, to accuse them of killing their mothers was a massive deal to the Pharisees, who valued purity above all else. So to be clear, Jesus wasn't anti-leadership. He wasn't anti-law. He wasn't even anti-religion. He was anti-corruption, anti-hypocrisy, anti-exploitation in the name of holiness. He saw a system where religious elites weaponized God to protect their status, where they placed heavy burdens on others and did nothing to help lift them, where they loved the seat of honor, the applause, the image, but were spiritually bankrupt inside. He wasn't critiquing ordinary sinners. He was going directly to the top. And it wasn't just the religious elite. Jesus had plenty to say about political and economic power too. You know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. Not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must become your servant. That is Matthew chapter 20, verses 25 through 26, and that was Jesus speaking. That was Jesus redefining greatness as service, not domination. He didn't just tell people in power to be better. He said, you don't actually understand what power even is. It is not a gift to you. It is a burden and a responsibility to others. Also, when people tell you that Jesus was all about peace, love, and chill vibes, just remind them that he once flipped tables and cracked a whip in the middle of the temple. He walked into the holiest place in his culture, saw people using God to make money, and said, you've turned my father's house into a den of thieves. Matthew chapter 21, verse 13. That wasn't just righteous anger. That was a political act. The temple system was tied directly to the economy, the class structure, to control. And Jesus walked in and disrupted it, not with violence, but with confrontation. And let's be clear, he knew what it would cost him. The moment he flipped those tables, the countdown to his crucifixion began. Jesus didn't die because he told people to be nice. He died because he threatened the stability of the powerful, shamed the hypocrisy of the religious, and refused to play by the rules of the empire. And that's why he makes people uncomfortable even today. And for more context beyond the temple thing and the money changers in the temple, I would advise you to look into it yourself. I would go over it in this video, and I can address it in another video if you guys would like me to. However, this one's already running pretty long, so I want to get through the rest of this. However, I will provide some more context to the Pharisees themselves. We've talked about Jesus' confrontations of powers. There's one group that keeps coming up again and again, the Pharisees. So who were they, and why was Jesus constantly going off on them? Let's break it down, because this isn't just some ancient political beef. It gets at the very heart of what Jesus was trying to fix. The Pharisees were one of several Jewish sects operating in the first century Judean world. They weren't priests. That was mostly the Sadducees. They weren't revolutionaries. That was more the Zealots. The Pharisees were more like a religious political movement focused on purity, law, and tradition. They believed that the Jewish people needed to obey the law of Moses perfectly, and also follow a large set of oral traditions in order for God to bless or rescue Israel. They weren't cartoon villains. In fact, by the standards of the time, they were often seen as righteous, devout, and committed to God's law. But Jesus saw through it, and he called them out not because they were Jewish. Jesus was also Jewish, but because they used religion as a tool for social superiority and control. And to be clear, Jesus' issue with the Pharisees wasn't that they followed the law, it was that they weaponized it. They turned the law into a performance, a checklist for public approval, a way to elevate themselves while crushing everyone else under a weight of guilt, shame, and spiritual bureaucracy. In Matthew chapter 23, verse 4, Jesus says, they tie up heavy burdens hard to bear and lay them on people's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to move them with their finger. They would pray loudly in public to be seen of men. They would fast in a way that makes people notice. They would make a huge show of being holy, and Jesus saw through it all. In Mark chapter 7, verse 6, Jesus says, these people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. His critique wasn't of Judaism. It was not of Torah. It wasn't even religious leadership as a concept. It was, you've taken something sacred and made it hollow for yourself. And to be clear, because historically this is a loaded topic, this part is extremely critical. Jesus was not condemning the Jews. He was Jewish. His disciples were Jewish. His mother, brothers, friends, all Jewish. The early church, mostly comprised of Jewish individuals. This wasn't an ethnic or religious critique. It was a moral and spiritual one, aimed at a specific group of power holders who used God's name to gain clout, maintain control, and avoid self-reflection. If Jesus were here today, he'd probably say the same thing to televangelists, megapastors, or anyone who uses religious language to get rich, avoid scrutiny, or stay politically relevant. Jesus wasn't punching down, he was punching up. And that's what he always did. And the people who hated him the most were the ones whose thrones were made of scripture, but whose hearts were made of stone. So, speaking of weaponizing the law, one of the reoccurring themes in Jesus' teachings and his confrontations is about the law, not just any law, religious law, sacred law, the kind of law that is written in stone. Now, in the Jewish tradition, the law, or Torah, was central to life. It wasn't just a moral compass, it was an identity, a covenant, a structure for thriving. And among all the laws, the Sabbath stood out. A full day of rest, no work, no labor, a command given straight from God, right up there with don't kill and don't steal. But somewhere along the way, something shifted. What was meant to protect people started getting used to control them. There were hundreds of rules about what counted as work, so many that people were afraid to even move too much, just in case it was considered a violation of the Sabbath. And then came along Jesus. And what does he do? He heals people on the Sabbath. He feeds people on the Sabbath. He walks through fields of grain with his disciples, all on the Sabbath. And the Pharisees lose their mind about this. You're breaking the law, they claimed. You're disrespecting the Sabbath. But Jesus doesn't just ignore them, he challenges their entire interpretation. In the book of Mark, chapter 2, verse 27, Jesus says, "The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath." And that one sentence, that's a philosophical sledgehammer for the time. Jesus is saying, you've got it backwards. The Sabbath was not meant to be a prison. It wasn't meant to make life harder. It was supposed to be a gift, a rhythm of rest, protection, and dignity in a world where people were worked to death. You weren't created to serve the Sabbath. The Sabbath was created to serve you. But the religion at the time had a tendency to forget that because laws are easy to enforce. Compassion is not. Jesus didn't accidentally heal people on the Sabbath. He chose to, deliberately, to make a point every time. When the religious leaders confronted him for healing a disabled man, he basically says, "Would you rather I let him suffer so I can say that I followed a rule?" And in the actual text, it's Luke chapter 14, verse 5. "If your ox fell into a ditch on the Sabbath, wouldn't you pull it out?" He's forcing them and us to answer the question, who does your rule help? Is this law serving love or just serving your image of control? Because if the law demands that you let someone suffer, then your law doesn't reflect God. It reflects you and your need for control. Jesus wasn't breaking the law just to be a lawbreaker. He didn't come to start chaos, even if chaos ensued. What he did was reveal the purpose behind the law and show how far people had wandered from it. He fulfilled the law by bringing it back to its roots: compassion, justice, mercy, love. And when the law got in the way of that, Jesus picked compassion every single time. And now it's time to talk about the hardest thing that Jesus ever said. "But I say to you, love your enemies. Bless those who curse you. Do good to those who hate you, and pray for those who spitefully use you and persecute you." Matthew 5, verse 44. You hear that and think, sure, that sounds noble. Or maybe you hear that and think, that sounds like a fool. But it doesn't sound noble or foolish even. It's not if you actually had an enemy, not if you've ever been betrayed, humiliated, abused, cheated, or hurt, not if someone burned you to the ground and smiled while doing it. Because in the real world, where wounds are deep and grudges feel like armor, this isn't just hard, it's unthinkable for many people. And even today, in a culture obsessed with forgiveness and healing and moving on, very few people actually do this. We forgive strategically when it feels good. We love conditionally if we think they've earned it. And we want justice, or if we're being honest, vengeance, dressed up in therapeutic language that serves our purposes. So when Jesus says, love your enemies, not just tolerate them, not ignore them, not spiritually vibe past them so you don't have to even acknowledge them, but actively love them. He's not just being poetic, he's rebuilding the framework of justice from scratch, saying, you have it wrong with your cycles of vengeance and hatred. Now, let's be very clear about what this doesn't mean, because people abuse this teaching too. It does not mean letting your enemies keep hurting you. It does not mean pretending nothing happened. It does not mean excusing evil or surrendering your dignity. Jesus was not saying stay in toxic relationships or let injustice walk free. This isn't pacifism. This isn't codependence. This isn't letting someone put a knife in your back twice just to prove that you're holy. What it does mean, however, is that Jesus is saying, don't let your hate transform you, even when you feel justified, even when it would feel so good, even when the rest of the world would do it. To love your enemy is to refuse to becoming what they are, to refuse to let their ugliness dictate your story. It is choosing to see the human being buried beneath the enemy's mask, even if they never see the human in you. And that's what makes this philosophy so deadly serious. It's not just a moral suggestion, it's a blueprint for liberating yourself from the gravitational pull of vengeance. Because if you're not any better than the person who is your enemy, then what claim do you have to righteousness other than saying, well, I'm me, so I'm right? Loving your enemy isn't weakness, it's power, because anyone can hate. But to love in the face of hatred, that takes strength most people will never reach. That is not soft. That's not passive. That's transcendent. And most people can't even do this. It's what turns the cycle of violence into dust. It's what took Rome's empire and cracked it from the inside out. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do, to the men who just tortured and are currently murdering him. That's not poetic. That's defiance. That's looking hate in the face and saying, you do not get to win here. There's a line from Jesus that gets quoted constantly, usually to shut someone up. And that's Matthew chapter 7, verse 1. Do not judge, or you too will be judged. Jesus speaking. And a lot of people love that one. It becomes some sort of spiritual trump card. You can't call anything wrong. Jesus said not to judge. But here's the thing. That's not what he meant. Jesus didn't say, don't think. He didn't say, don't evaluate. He didn't say, don't ever form opinions about right and wrong. Jesus was saying, don't judge people like you're God, but do discern truth like you give a damn, because you should. There's a difference between being a judge and being a witness. Judges pass sentences. Witnesses tell the truth, even when it's hard. Jesus didn't call us to moral apathy or to let anything go. He called us to moral clarity without arrogance, to truth without cruelty, to vision without superiority. Judgment and discernment are not the same thing. Condemns and discernment understands. Let's sharpen the distinction even more, because this is where people get it twisted. Judgment is laying the charge to someone's soul. Discernment is simply taking their actions as they are and acting accordingly in response. I can say what you did was evil, but it is not my place to say your soul is evil, because the truth is plenty of good people do evil things, just like many evil people occasionally do good things. You cannot tell the content of someone's soul, so do not try. Jesus didn't say, let everyone do whatever. He said, don't pretend to know the contents of a soul that you didn't make. Give others the mercy you'd want for yourself. That doesn't mean letting people run wild. This doesn't mean moral blindness. This doesn't mean excusing harm because, well, maybe they're just broken. No, you can love your enemies and still name the damage that they are causing. You can set boundaries and you can take action to stop them. You can even punish if you're in a position of authority to do so. But the difference is in the spirit of the principle. You stop bad actions. You don't crush the person who created those bad actions. And if you must punish, you do not celebrate. There's a line that I like that is, it is a tragedy that they ever got here. And now it is even more of a tragedy that we have to punish them. That is how justice should feel. Not gleeful, not victorious, not smug, tragic. Because when we start celebrating the fall of bad people, we forget that they could have just as easily not been bad. They could have never gone down this road. They could have been our friends, our family. And if someone is so far gone that we have to punish them, we should not celebrate this. We should be sad that we ever had to. No matter how evil they were, no matter what they did, we don't have to abide that evil, but we don't have to be happy that we're punishing evil. We should be sad that they were evil in the first place. This doesn't mean that you don't act. It just means you don't get to play executioner with a smile. Even the one who betrayed Jesus, Judas Iscariot, even when he was betraying him, Jesus still called him friend because he was sad that his friend had betrayed him. This is shown clearly in "Forgive them, for they know not what they do." There's a line that Jesus speaks as he's hanging on the cross, nailed through his wrists, body ripped to shreds, people mocking him, spit drying on his face, the air thick with blood and iron and shame. And in that moment, when he has every reason to curse the people killing him, the people torturing him, instead of being angry, he says, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." Let that sink in, not after the fact, not when he's resurrected and safe and glowing and victorious, but in the middle of it, while they're still torturing him. He says, "Forgive them." But didn't they know exactly what they were doing? You'd think so. They were laughing. They beat him within inches of his life. They seemed to enjoy it. They gambled for his clothes like he was already a corpse. It doesn't get more cruel than that. So why would Jesus say that they didn't know? Because he understood something that most of us never do. Sometimes people do evil not because they're monsters, but because they're trying to survive the systems that made them. And the only way to do that is to put on the face of a monster. Maybe the Roman soldiers did what they did because that was their job. Maybe it was the only way they could eat. Maybe it was because they were numb from years of violence. Maybe the only way they could live with it was to stop seeing their victims as human beings. Maybe they didn't know who he was, or maybe they didn't even want to know who he was, and maybe they didn't know themselves anymore. Who's to say what was going on in their minds, in their hearts? The action of killing another human being is evil. That's not up for debate. But Jesus is saying their soul, I'm not condemning that. I'm giving their soul the benefit of the doubt. And that's the difference between justice and mercy. And let's be clear, most of the art you've seen of crucifixion is sanitized, a little blood, some tasteful bruising, a solemn halo. But the actual torture and torment was so much more vivid and visceral than that. The movie The Passion of the Christ is widely considered the most brutal depictions of Jesus' suffering, and even that was still a watered down version of what really happened. Roman scourging wasn't just painful, it was dehumanizing. The whips had bone and metal woven into them, and they tore flesh from bone. Crucifixion wasn't just execution, it was theater, a public statement of this is what happens to people like him. It was meant to be humiliating and painful and a deterrent from doing whatever the crucified person did. It was not a simple death, and it certainly was not sightly. And despite the torture and the torment and the humiliation and the mockery and everything like that, he still says, "Forgive them." And it's not even because they deserve it or because they asked for it, and not even because it makes any moral sense to most people, but because mercy, real mercy, is not about what people deserve. Certainly not what we think they deserve. It's about who you choose to be, even when everyone else has failed. It is the choice for you to say, "I will be better." And so that brings us to the closing of why this philosophy matters and why so many fail it. After all this, after turning the other cheek, walking the extra mile, loving your enemies, forgiving your executioners, you might be thinking, "Oh, okay, that's deep, but who actually lives like this?" And the truth is, most people don't. Not because it isn't beautiful, but because it's terrifying and because it's hard. It's hard to forgive when hate feels safer. It's hard to show mercy when you're still bleeding. And it's hard to walk the second mile when you're already tired of carrying the weight from the first. And yet, that is what Jesus asked for, not glory, not vengeance, not dominance, but transcendence. Transcendence of the norm through love, humility, restraint, mercy, and radical compassion. And that's why this philosophy matters, because if you've ever actually tried to live like this, not perfectly, but honestly, you'd see that something the world doesn't know what to do with. And that brings us to the failure of Christendom. And here's where we have to tell the truth. Because if you think Christendom, meaning the entire political, cultural, and institutional empire that rose up claiming to represent Jesus, actually lived out his philosophy, you haven't been paying attention. Christendom gave us the Crusades, wars drenched in blood launched in Jesus' name, the Inquisitions torturing people for theological noncompliance, colonialism and conquest, often with a cross in one hand and a sword in the other, burning, censorship, excommunications, corruption, oppression, all done while quoting the man who said, "Blessed are the meek." Jesus said to love your enemies. Christendom crucified its enemies, literally, in his name. This wasn't just a failure, it was a betrayal. Let's be clear, this wasn't just imperfect people doing their best. It was a systematic betrayal of everything Jesus actually stood for. He flipped tables in the temple. Christendom built cathedrals over palaces of power. He healed the sick for free. And Christendom sold indulgences. He said, "Put away your sword," and Christendom raised armies. You can't read the Gospels and come away thinking Jesus would be cool with any of what many people throughout history did in his name. And yet, despite all that, the philosophy still stands. Despite the failure of kings, popes, priests, televangelists, and empires, his words remain because his words weren't built on power, at least not earthly power. They were built on truth. And truth doesn't rot because the people who claim it do. So the question isn't, did Christianity live up to Jesus? It didn't, not even close. The real question is, will you live up to his teachings? And that's not a religious question. That's just a philosophical, moral question. You don't even have to touch the divinity of Jesus to ask yourself that. And it turns out in a lot of ways, Jesus was right. So you might have followed me this far and still think, okay, sure, it sounds beautiful in theory, but does any of this actually work? Well, if you're looking for proof, here it is. Modern psychology and behavioral science have done study after study on things like forgiveness and mental health, empathy and social bonding, acts of service and happiness, compassion and neurological well-being. And they keep finding the same thing, that people who forgive tend to live longer. People who show compassion tend to have stronger relationships. People who serve others, not as a performance, but from the heart, are happier than people who only chase self-interest. In fact, mutual service, when you care for others and they care for you, creates something called pro-social reciprocity. Yeah, I butchered that word. I'm going to keep going though, which is literally one of the most powerful predictors of sustained human happiness. Not comfort, not wealth, not pleasure, but connection, mercy, giving a damn about someone other than yourself. Even science is starting to catch up. So if you're someone who thinks in terms of data, fine. The teachings of Jesus actually work. Maybe not always easily, maybe not perfectly, but over time, consistently, they create something that looks a lot like peace, real peace, not just performative peace. And Jesus took his ideology to the cross. When he said, love your enemies, he didn't mean it when it was convenient. He meant it even when they kill you, and he proved that he believed what he said, not just in words, but in action, in his own blood. So whether you believe in Jesus as God or not, you still have to deal with Jesus the philosopher, the one whose ideas outlasted every empire, the one who looked into the face of cruelty and answered with love. And maybe, just maybe, that's the only kind of love that can actually save us and make the world a better place. And yeah, maybe the world will never be that way. Maybe the world will never love its enemies. Maybe people will never forgive what should be unforgivable. Maybe the world will never trade power for peace or pride for humility. Maybe our job was never to change the whole world. Our job is to take the world as it is and choose every day to be the best version of yourself in it. So even if no one else stands with you, be better. Even if people mock you, betray you, abandon you, be better. And even if they crucify you, be better. As Jesus said, be therefore perfect, as your Father in heaven is perfect. You are the light of the world. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. Even if you don't believe the light will last forever, even if you don't believe in God, you don't need to. Light still always defeats darkness, but it doesn't happen by accident. To be better, you have to work. You have to change. You have to wake up every single day and say, I will be better than I was yesterday, not because it's easy, but because it is hard. And that's the path Jesus walked. He could have been a king, literally. They were ready to crown him a warlord. He could have seized power, raised an army, and crushed his enemies, but he said, "No, my kingdom is not of this world." And then he rode into Jerusalem as people shouted and waved palm branches, thinking their military messiah had finally come. He didn't ride in on a war horse. He rode in humble on a donkey, because the kingdom he was building was never about conquering the world. It was about conquering yourself. And so with that, I'm at my conclusion for today. If you guys are interested in a part 2 of this, I'd be more than willing to do so. If you want to engage in the comments and you've made it this far, I would trust that you'll do so graciously and whatnot. And again, this isn't even about divinity. This is just about a guy who said some things that make a lot of sense to me. And I don't think you need to believe that he was God to, and I mean, I think you should examine that. It's a pretty big claim. And I think it's worthy of examination, but you don't have to even agree with the guy really to see what he was saying and respect the devotion and commitment behind it. If we want the world to be better, we can't just keep doing what our ancestors have been doing. People want a better world, but people don't want to change. And you can't have it both ways. If everything sucks or everything's declining and everyone's acting the same way, but everyone feels justified within themselves because, oh, well, it's me. I can do that. I know better. I know best. Like, if you want a better world, you have to change the world. And the only way that you can change the world is to change yourself within the world. And I just think it's important that we remember that. So yeah, again, guys, thank you for listening this far. And I'm sorry if the quality dropped off a bit. It's still a little bit of a challenge for me to make videos, but I really want to do my best to have examinations and good conversation like this. So if you haven't, please subscribe and all that. It does me wonders for my drive to continue. Leave a comment. Helps engagement on the video. I'd love to hear what you have to say. And I mean that sincerely. I'm not just trying to bait you into commenting. I'm curious what people have to say. I can't promise a reply. A lot of this stuff is very mentally taxing. And as much as I love to try and reply to everyone meaningfully, it's a lot to do. So yeah, I'll ask is for good faith. As I presented this video in good faith, it wasn't to convince you of anything other than the philosophy part. So I hope I did a good job. And I hope I gave you something to think about. Yeah, do better. We all got to do better every single day. Be better. Even if you're perfect, be better than perfect. Keep going. And I love you guys.